My name is Kenneth Bertrams. I'm chairing the Department of History, and I'm really happy to see you today. Also in the name of our faculty, Faculty of Philosophy and Social Science. This is an important chair. This is the 11th edition of this international chair for the history of the Second World War. And I will be very brief because we have important, of course, discussion to have today. As you will see in the following minutes, a series of persons will be introducing our speaker today. Most importantly, it is also my pleasure to thank, in particular, the Welge family, who has been a present support for this chair for the last 11 years. It is really a token of friendship and of faith for this research chair. And I would like also to associate my gratitude to Professor Peter Lagroux, who has been the academic responsible for this chair. And I think in the last 11 years, we've seen a series of very great scholars trying to see and to change the different angles of this the history of Second World War. So, as you can see, I was very brief, I hope, and I will directly give the floor to Baudouin Welge, who is the representative of the Welge family for the support of this chair. Thank you very much, Baudouin Welge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bertrams. Dear professors, dear family and friends, dear students, dear Professor O'Brien. Thanks to all of you being present again at what, as Kenneth Bertrams just reminded, is the 11th edition of our chair, which was launched in 2012. And at that time, we promised the university that we would last for at least 10 editions. And the success of the chair, and what better proof of it than your presence today, convinced us to go on for at least another 5 years. The chair was the idea of my father, Baron Jean-Charles Welge, and who wanted to honor the memory of his friend Jean van Welkenhuizen, the famous Belgian historian of the Second World War. My father himself had developed a passion for the history of the Second World War, and he had befriended Jean van Welkenhuizen, who was the first director of the Centre de Recherche et d'Études Historiques de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, which is now the CGSOMA. Both were convinced that the knowledge of the past would enable us to respond better to the challenges of the present. And Papa came up with the idea of inviting his grandchildren every year to visit a battlefield of the Second World War in the company of Jean van Welkenhuizen, who would bring the events to life and put them in perspective. Several friends gradually joined the expedition. We went to the Ardennes, to the Maginot Line, to Dieppe, and even to London for the Battle of Britain and the Churchill war rooms. When Jean van Welkenhuizen died in February 2008, Papa wanted to honor his memory in a lasting way. And he contacted Didier Vivier, who was then Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters, from which history depended, to look into setting up a chair at the ULB. And the project was nearly ready when, sadly enough, he died himself. And so my mother, who died actually also a year ago, my brothers and I naturally decided to see this project through, and that's how the chair in the history of the Second World War was born. The chair quickly built a solid reputation, rewarding leading historians who do not hesitate to challenge established truths. But whereas my father and Jean van Welkenhuizen concentrated on the military part of the history of the war, the chairholders concentrated mainly on other important aspects of history. For example, last year, Claire Andrieux studied the way in which fallen pilots were treated by the inhabitants of the countries in which they fell. A few years ago, Florent Braillard explained why it was useful to edit a new translation of Mein Kampf. And 2 years earlier, Kerstin von Lingen had exposed the thinking that led, over a period of nearly 100 years, to the concept of crime against humanity and eventually the Nuremberg process. My father would thus be very pleased that for the first time we have a presentation by a military historian. The Ukrainian war, launched by the Russians 2 years ago, has shown very vividly how important logistics, armament, terrain, and soldiers are in a war. Timothy Schneider, the now famous Yale professor who won the very first edition of this chair in 2012, stressed right away in one of his numerous articles and podcasts about the Russo-Ukrainian war that we should concentrate on the military aspects of the war rather than, for example, on the psychology of Vladimir Putin, to analyze and understand where the war was going on. Schneider's book, for which he was invited to this chair, is called Bloodlands. And these bloodlands include Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, the 3 Baltic states, northeastern Romania, and the westernmost fringes of Russia. It's estimated that 14 million civilians died in these countries, which is over 60% of the civilians who died in Europe during the war. And actually 5 million civilians died in Ukraine alone. And it's a tribute to the insightfulness of the jury that Ukraine was at the center of no less than 3 lectures of this chair. Timothy Schneider, of course, but also Andrei Portnov, whom we invited just after the Russian invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, and Philippe Sands, whose book East-West Street, in French Retour à Lemberg, happens in Lviv, the present name of Lemberg, one of the cities we have learned to know, sadly enough, over the last 2 years. So I'm particularly happy that Professor O'Brien has accepted to be this year's laureate. He, like Timothy Schneider, has been a very active commentator of the Russo-Ukrainian war. As I just indicated, he's a military historian who has stressed a few years ago in a widely acclaimed book, it's here, highly recommended, that superiority in the air and the sea rather than battle on land determined the outcome of the Second World War. As you can see on the slide behind me, when comparing the economic power of the belligerents, the Russian economy is 10 times that of Ukraine, which makes the outcome of a confrontation between both apparently very obvious. However, the UK would not have defeated Germany in 1945 without the help of the US. And the present US economy is nearly 15 times larger than that of Russia. In fact, that of the EU is 10 times larger than that of Russia. The Russian economy, as we have frequently read in the papers, is actually just a bit larger than the Spanish economy. In other words, if we really want the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians, it should be no problem at all. At least if we open our wallets and stop hesitating sending the required resources. I hope we will not need a Pearl Harbor for that, as was necessary to convince the US Congress in 1941. But before leaving the floor to Professor O'Brien, I'll ask Peter Lagroux, the driving force between this chair, to introduce him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baudouin. Just a few words on our laureate of this year. So, Phillips Payson O'Brien is Professor of History and Strategic Studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Before that, he taught history at the University of Glasgow. He obtained his BA in Trinity College, which is a small liberal arts college in Connecticut, USA. He grew up in Boston. Then obtained his PhD in Cambridge at Pembroke College. Well, he was a research fellow at Pembroke for a few years before joining the University of Glasgow. So indeed, in 2015, he published, and I will hand it around, this major book, How the War Was Won, Air, Sea Power and the Allied Victory in World War II. In 2019, he published the second major book, The Second Most Powerful Man in the World, The Life of Admiral William Lehigh, Roosevelt's Chief of Staff. But it is especially the 2015 book, How the War Was Won, that inspired us to invite him here today. And indeed, as Baudouin Velge already mentioned, the logistics of conventional warfare are a theme that has been totally neglected in the 10 previous editions, which were very much about human cost and human investment in war. In a way, we were made to believe for over 70 years that conventional warfare was very much a thing of the past, that any conflicts that could inspire us today were about asymmetrical, unconventional warfare. And to be totally honest with you, Phil, I discovered about your work in an article in the New York Times, an editorial by Paul Krugman in January 2023. So this is not very long time ago, and 8 years after the publication of the book. Shame on me. And in this article, Krugman explained exactly what Baudouin just showed. Well, yes, that logistics do matter, and that conventional warfare having returned to the European continent, we should probably draw inspiration from precisely the kind of analysis the book of Philip could offer us. And from this article, I read his analysis of the ongoing war in Ukraine in the Atlantic on Twitter, now X. I bought the book and read the book, and I was struck by the sharp and critical analysis that he could offer to the ongoing conflict. And as I hope we all know, history holds no lessons for the present, but it does offer perspective. And it is precisely what Phil has been doing for the last 2 years. Writing very much an anti-revisionist, being an anti-revisionist revisionist. And one of the reasons I'm particularly glad that he is here is that he proved me wrong in his book. For more than 20 years, I've been teaching to my students, some of them present here, that, well, if we want to understand the Second World War, we just have to look at Stalingrad. We just have to look at the lion's share of the fighting that was put up by the Red Army. And I have repeated this year after year that 80% of the military effort was put up by the Red Army facing the Wehrmacht. And the remaining 20%, say, quantité négligeable, was put up by the other belligerents, by the UK and Great Britain. Now, this is a story that Phil has thoroughly demolished in his book, and I'm sure he will do so today and in the following lectures. So we have follow-up lectures tomorrow. The lecture tomorrow will not be here, but in room AZ101, AAZ1, 1101, which is on the courtyard, but you will find it's on the courtyard where the old library is in the angle, so not here. On Wednesday and on Thursday, we meet again in this auditorium. There was a little bit of confusion. The lecture on Thursday will start, as all the lectures, at 6 p.m. sharp. We sent out an announcement that we had to change the schedule. In the end, no, we stick to the initial planning. It will be 6 p.m., no 5 p.m. We will send out a reminder to the people who have registered, but so Thursday also 6 p.m. Now it is urgently the time to hand the microphone to Phil and to thank him warmly for being here. Thank you.
Before I start, I would actually, of course, like to express my gratitude for the invitation here, for Ken, Peter, and of course the family for everything you've done to make this lecture series and this chair possible. This is certainly not the kind of lectures I would have expected to give 3 years ago. I would not be asked to reflect on a Second World War book about logistics and production and think about an ongoing war in Europe today, which bears quite a lot of resemblance strategically to that war in terms of questions of logistics and production and air power and the like, and yet here we are. And the talks I'm going to give, make sure this is it, are really not lessons at all. I have no idea what the lessons of this war are. I'm asked all the time, can I write a piece on the lessons of the war? And I sort of respond, that's crazy. All I can do is make a rough idea of what the questions might be that we're facing now. And so what I'm going to try and do in these lectures is reflect back on some of the ideas in how the war was won and put them in a framework or use them to construct a framework to analyze what we are seeing in Ukraine today. The first lecture is really looking back at the book. By the way, I'm assuming most of you have not yet read the 250,000 exciting words that it has, and that's fine. My mother hasn't read it either. So I'm not expecting people to have read it in massive detail. So I will give a bit of an overview of the arguments first. And then in the coming lectures, I'm going to engage with a number of questions on logistics, on air power, and on the future of war. So today is looking back at the book with some original questions. So I thought I'd begin by saying what a war's not won by, because the book actually starts with a negative. And it was deliberately written that way to try and engage with military historians, and by the way, popular military history as well, and say, the paradigm that we've constructed about how wars are won and lost seems to me deeply problematic. So I chose as the first sentences, there were no decisive battles in World War II. This was an attempt to say that when you look at a battle, and by the way, most of the books are about battles. If you go to your Second World War section in most bookstores, and by the way, in most English language bookstores, that will be the largest section in the bookstore. I don't know if that's the case here, but if you go to an English language section and you look in the history, the World War II section will be by far the largest. It will dominate. Most of the books you will see will be about Nazis, but there will be a lot of books about generals, on battles, and campaigns. So the war is presented, and this is similar to most wars, the war is presented as a series of battles, and battles sort of create the conditions of victory and defeat. But I sort of thought I wanted to look at the war differently, away from that, and to move it away from what I would call the emotive power that is used to describe war. So I don't care about bravery, I don't care about daring, I don't care about brilliant generalship. All of those occur. There is bravery, there is cowardice in war, there is kindness, there is cruelty in war. All of that occurs. What I'm arguing is that doesn't actually create victory or defeat. So there is the human experience of war, and it's incredibly important that we study the human experience. What we can't do is go from the human experience and go, aha, this explains why the war worked out the way it did. So what I tried to do, in fact, I would argue it distorts it. It creates a human kind of patina of our understanding. So we look how many people suffered here, and therefore that must be important in the process of victory. And actually, I tried to challenge that in the argument. So really, when you talk about battles, and I'm going to develop this in today's lecture, what is interesting about battles to me are battles cause nothing. And I'm going to explain what I mean about it. They simply reveal. A battle reveals the present state of the war. It reveals what each side has been able to manufacture at the time, what each side has been able to deploy at the time. Very few, if any, battles had any, you might say, drama about their outcome. The only one might have been the fall of France in 1940. That still has certain counterfactuals. You would say, you know, the equation of forces on either side meant it didn't have to work out that way. But almost every other battle in the Second World War worked out exactly the way it was going to work out, approximately. You know, the Allies were going to get ashore at D-Day. That was going to happen. The battles themselves were not ones of, we might say, an unexpected ending. They have very, very predictable endings because what they are doing, as the last quote, battles reveal. They reveal the present state of the forces at play in the war. They don't cause. So I'm trying to row back from the causal explanation of a battle sort of making anything occur. Instead, what the book does is try to express war, the process of war, as an ongoing, continual process of force creation and destruction. And you have to start all the way at the beginning of the force creation, long way before you get to the battlefield, to understand what is going on. And you have to look at that whole series of production steps to deployment, to finally getting into battle and seeing how and where things are destroyed. I put that chart up because in many ways that chart was one of the reasons I ended up writing the book. I never thought I was going to write this book. In fact, I was sort of goofing around one day when I was doing my PhD. And I suppose being a bit of a nerd, I opened up the US Strategic Bombing Survey to goof around. And I took out, the US Bombing Survey has astonishingly good charts on production. If you want to find out about German and Japanese production in the Second World War, you should probably go to the Strategic Bombing Survey. And if you look at that chart, that basically is German production effort 1944. Right? What were the Germans actually making? What were they doing in terms of what they were spending their resources on? And that chart made no sense to me compared to how I had been expected to understand the war. I had been told the war was, as Peter said, a huge land war on the Eastern Front with thousands of tanks, and that what we were dealing with here was a massive land war. And by the way, exactly that's what I had been taught, and that's what when I started teaching as a graduate student, that's what I first said. And yet, when that German production chart was thrown up to me, that didn't make any sense, that the Germans are spending almost half building just the aircraft. That doesn't include the ammunition to arm the aircraft. The Germans are spending 6 times as much building aircraft as they are building all tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Right? It's a massive imbalance in what they're doing. And that just started bells ringing in my head, thinking, well, if that's true, one, why are they doing that? Why are they doing something that is very different than the way the war is normally portrayed? And then what does that mean about where these aircraft went and what they were doing? And indeed, as it turns out, if you look at the German war economy, basically 55 to 60% of it is building aircraft and arming them during the war. That naval vessel, by the way, in 1944 is artificially low because by 1944 the Germans were running out of naval bases. So they couldn't actually build that much naval. Normally that would be closer to 10%. So when you went and actually broke down what the Germans were doing in the Second World War, in just aircraft and naval vessels, you normally had, before you started anything, 2/3 of the German economy building air and sea weapons. All right. And there's another thing, if you went into the weapons part, which seems large, about 1/3 of that is anti-aircraft weapons to fire at Allied. So you start breaking down the economy. That's what became interesting to me. So in other words, I tried to say that we should reframe the war away from the drama and battles to see a constant process of this. What are they making and where is it going and how is it getting destroyed? That's the basic thing. That's what it is. That's what war was to me. It's very much a materialist analysis. And I make no apologies for that. It's not ones on soldiers. Indeed, this is an interesting, and we can have this discussion in the question. I think soldiers are sent where the Germans don't have equipment because basically they're flooding the Eastern Front with infantry because they can't send anything else there. They don't have any aircraft to send there, so they're trying to hold the line with poorly armed infantry. So soldiers, to me, are not a sign of effort. They're a sign, actually, of them desperately trying to use something to plug the gap as they fight the air-sea war. So it's a very materialist. one. And indeed, if you look at it from that point, you will have a very different view. So I started getting into this idea of, let's see how things were made, where they went, and how they were destroyed, to see if that ends up presenting a different idea of how the war developed. To give you an example, by the way, of how instantly this started changing my view, at least of the war, I started thinking about the Battle of Kursk. This actually comes from the introduction. So I just threw it up there as an example of how we could change our view. Now you have probably heard of the Battle of Kursk as maybe the largest battle in Europe ever. You know, the largest battle of the Second World War, often, with the most tanks, the most soldiers on either side. You know, this massive sort of slugfest in 1943. Indeed, there are about 7,000 to 8,000 tanks in the fighting. There are 2 million soldiers in Kursk. And the way it is written, this is sort of a turning point moment of the war. It's the last German great offensive on the Eastern Front. They throw everything into it. You know, they do some damage, but in the end it doesn't work out, and sort of that is a decisive end of German offensive activity, but then leads to a spiral of German retreat. Well, I actually then started counting. How many German tanks were there? How many did they lose? And you know, how is that a percentage of loss? Well, actually, if you look at the figures, during the first 2 weeks of Kursk, or first 10 days, the Germans lose 350 tanks. Okay? During the year, they make 12,000. All right? So they lose 2% of the tanks they built in 1943 during Kursk. Indeed, on the entire Eastern Front, for July and August, they lose 1,300 tanks. So they only lose just over 10% of the tanks they build in the summer of 1943. And if you go back and realize how little they're building actually tanks of their economy, the German armor lost at Kursk is 0.2 of 1% of German output of the year. Right? It's a footnote. It actually doesn't represent much German production, nor did the Germans see it as representing much production. So the losses that come from Kursk are in no way crippling to the German economy. They don't represent, in fact, it's mostly older tanks. So the Germans are losing older equipment and replacing it with newer. There's an interesting argument you can make. The German army is materially much stronger at the end of 1943 than in the beginning of 1943. The difference is the Allies are much, much stronger. So war is this process of constant generation, and it's who wins the generation process of power. So Kursk is not a great blow to German power. It doesn't lose the Germans a great deal of equipment. It merely reveals what is going on at the war at the time. So what I ended up doing was trying to understand that process. And what seemed to me, the more I got into it, and again, this is a little bit nerdy, but you could actually break the production process down into 3 distinct steps. And each one of them were part of war. Certainly they were part of the logistics of war. And they took in many ways and destroyed many more pieces of equipment than actually went into the battle themselves. So indeed, these 3 steps are just as, or in some ways I would argue, more important than what happens on the battlefield itself. You have to understand the competition of these earlier steps. They are pre-production, production, and deployment steps. And I'll talk a little bit about them because they provide the intellectual framework. And by the way, they provide a very interesting intellectual framework for what is happening in Ukraine today. All right? And sort of how you get equipment made and bring it to the battlefield. Pre-production is basically everything that goes into the making of the material before the factory starts putting it together. All right? It's the pre-factory stage of production. It is by far the most complex, usually the most expensive, the most sort of difficult to manage, and also arguably the greatest test of a state's ability to wage more. You have to, one, accumulate the capital needed to create the industry, which is not easy to do. Where are you going to get the money? But then, once you have the money, you have to decide to spend it properly. You can either spend it building completely ludicrous V2 rockets that cost as much as a German atom bomb project and do almost no damage, or you can spend them building, brilliant Mustang fighters. But you don't know that. You have to make the right judgment calls along in that pre-production phase. So you have to assemble the capital, you have to assemble the raw materials. By the way, that also is quite an interesting challenge in the Second World War. And then you have to put into place the production facilities. Most Second World War production is in relatively new factories by 1943, because basically earlier factories couldn't handle the stress. And if you were going to build new things, you had to build whole new production facilities. And I would argue this is probably the most complex step, and it is a direct competition in war. But how many great books have you read about pre-production construction compared to Nazis? Yeah, it's just not one that gets a lot of coverage. The next, what I'm calling the production stage, that is actually once all this pre-production work has been done, then the darn things are made. So once you've assembled the money, the capital, and the factory, you have the stage where you actually build it. Now that, interestingly, gets some focus in the Second World War, and afterwards, mostly because people think they can drop bombs on these factories. So you have some discussion of the production phase, though I would argue it's actually, of the three phases, probably the least important. Because once you have the factory up and running, it's either going to produce well or it's not going to produce well. And there's questions of productivity, and you can tweak them, but the factory is what the factory is, the workers are what the workers are. It's very difficult to put a factory out of operation directly. It's far more easy to put it out of production by depriving it of things like raw materials. And finally, there was the phase of which there was very little written about, but the more I read about it, the more fascinated I became, which was the deployment stage. Well, what do you do with the stuff once you build it? You're in a war. It's not that you can easily just say, okay, I'm going to move this to the front, which is 2,000 miles away, depending on where you are, or if you're in the Pacific, 5,000 miles away out of overseas. It's actually really hard to do that. It's an enormous test of a logistic system. And you're not just delivering the thing, you're delivering the spare parts for the thing. You're delivering the fuel to power the thing. You're delivering the technicians to put it all together on spot. So actually, what is astonishing in terms of losses is that, and I'm going to talk about that as a section, that actually in the deployment phase, both Germany and Japan by 43, 44 are losing more aircraft in deployment than they are in battles. Right? They simply aren't able to get them to the front in the shape to fight. Japanese, it's about 50%. All right, so this is an extraordinary loss phase. And then finally, by the way, only once you do these things do you finally get to the battle. So the battle gets, after this huge process of war fighting, do you finally get to the battle. And finally what I found is, battles don't make that much of a difference. It's general attrition anyway. Kursk might have a slightly higher destruction rate for a few days, but really it's everyday loss that matters more in the battlefield than that. So that intellectually was the framework of the book as time went by, and sort of how the war seemed to be operating to me. Now, these earlier phases, I was saying, and I'm going to just give a few examples to show you, had profound influence that you might not have expected. First is the pre-production. You can do an enormous amount to limit what another side can do in the pre-production phase. I never thought I'd be interested in bauxite. I don't know if is anyone in bauxite is basically the ore from which you from which aluminum is processed, or if you're British, aluminium. But I'm an American, so I'm going to say aluminum. So bauxite is the metal the ore which produces aluminum. Now you probably think steel's the most important metal of the Second World War. You're wrong, aluminum is, because you can't build an aircraft out of steel, it's too heavy. All right? You build an aircraft out of steel, it could fly about 50 miles per hour and it'll crash. You have to build aircraft out of aluminum because it's much more lightweight. It's lightweight, non-corrosive. It's a far more valuable metal in the Second World War than steel. So to check bauxite flows, you'll have a much greater idea of sort of economic sort of potential, and you can use that to either help or to hurt the other. Now, if I was going to say to you, what is the most successful German campaign of the Second World War in terms of the destruction of Allied equipment, you're probably not going to say the submarine campaign in the Gulf of Mexico in the first few months of 1942. All right, it's probably that's not going to jump to your head. And yet the Germans destroy more U.S. equipment in the pre-production phase there than at any other time in the war. Why? Because the U.S. is trying to ship a lot of bauxite up from South America. So basically it's shipping up from Guyana. There's sort of these aluminum flows, bauxite flows, from Jamaica as well. Jamaica is a lump of bauxite in these days. So having these flows of bauxite to the United States, and the Germans actually sink a good deal of those bauxite ships in early 1942. We can't say exactly what the loss is, but for the whole year, the American production rate of 1942 is about 50 to 60% below expectations. They still build a lot because it's the US economy, but they build far less than they think they're going to. And I would think the access to bauxite is far more important to that. So the Germans will do far more damage to what the US can do. You might say it delays the end of the war by about 6 months. Had they been able to put the US economy in full production throughout 42, the war could have ended much sooner. On the other hand, you can make a huge difference in helping your allies. The Soviet Union had one problem. It had no bauxite. Soviet Union in 1941 had access to almost no bauxite. So when Harry Hopkins, and I have this little vignette in the book, when Harry Hopkins, who is Roosevelt's sort of second son or emissary, arrives to see Stalin not long after Barbarossa, the first thing Stalin says is, please give us bauxite. You have to give us bauxite. And at that point, the US decides to turn on the taps. They give Russia more bauxite than the US Navy gets in the Second World War. Right? So basically, probably 60 to 70,000 aircraft worth of bauxite. If the Soviet Union doesn't have that, it doesn't have an air force. Right? So that's what I mean about the control of raw materials. And then the fighting on the Eastern Front would have been materially different because the Russians would not have been able to use air power because of their access to bauxite. On the other hand, the deployment stage. I talked about that briefly. Once you go from the factories to the front. Well, by 43, 44, about a quarter of German aircraft and half of Japanese aircraft do not arrive to the front in the good enough shape to fight. One, they're rushing them through production. They have flaws that come out. They land badly. They're often being flown by inexperienced pilots because you're using your really good pilots to fight at the front. You use your sort of second-rate pilots to fly the deployments. They're not very good. They land. They crack a wheel. Guess what? You don't have a repaired wheel. You don't have a spare wheel. So the Germans are cycling through these aircraft. They're flying. They're producing large numbers. If you look at German production, it's going up. If you're looking at German deployment, it's flat. So there's a real difference between what they're making and what actually they can deploy into battle. And the big difference is that they're just losing these aircraft in the deployment phase. For the Japanese, it's far worse because they have to fly out over the open seas. The Japanese, being a deployment pilot for the Japanese Army or Navy must have been one of the most terrifying jobs because you were given hardly any training and then basically told fly 800 miles over the Pacific. Good luck. And by 43, 44, half of the pilots are not making it. Right, so Japanese production is far lower. And that's sort of an example. Now, all of these, I would argue, were as the result of an Allied air or air-sea campaign that affected the processes before the battle. From that, strategic bombing, I would argue, was far more important than people realize. And I will go into a lot of this in more detail tomorrow. Tomorrow's lecture is going to be specifically about air power in the Second World War and in the Russo-Japanese War. Sorry, the Russo-Ukrainian War. So basically, we have to look at air power. And the Ukrainians, I might say, are slightly learning this lesson with these attacks on Russian oil refineries the last few days. The Ukrainians are starting to launch a campaign against Russian pre-production by trying to cripple Russian oil refining. Sorry, next slide. Now, this will just give you another example of how it affects the battle. Again, we talk about effort, battle, we talk about infantry. Now, you tell me 80% of German infantry are on the Eastern Front. I'm much more interested in where German fighter aircraft are going. And German fighter aircraft, by 1944, are more than 80% over, fighting the Western Allies over Germany itself. Even in March of 1943, before Kursk, the German deployment over Germany itself is by far the largest of any theater. It's almost the same as sort of German deployments in Germany and the West. I don't know if I have the point. Does the pointer work on this? Okay. Sorry. Well, these lines are terrible, and I do apologize for them. The upper line basically is Germany and the Western Front. So that's basically what is being deployed against the Allies in strategic bombing. Oh, cool, awesome. So that is what is basically fighting Allied bombers over Germany, just below 50% in March 1943, and then skyrockets by September to 70%, stays up there, and then in 44 it goes up even higher. The Eastern Front, which the Great Front, only has 28% in March 43, and even with the collapse of the Mediterranean Front by 1944, it's down to 20%. And if you want to break that down further, the Eastern Front's getting really crappy fighters. If you're a good fighter plane with a good pilot, you're almost always fighting over Germany itself. That's where the effort is going. So when we say, where are things being lost on the Eastern Front, it's because they're trying to plug the equipment hole with infantry. It's not because it's their main effort, it's because it's where they're not making their main effort. Would be the way you would turn that on its head. And that is a bit of a dull, I gotta make more. I do have very dull PowerPoints, and I apologize for these. They're mostly words and very badly made graphs. But if I can explain anything in the question stage, let me know. And how does this all work together for winning the war? Basically, what the air-sea war does over Germany and Japan is begins a process of collapsing their abilities to move. All right, what I say, it culminates in a collapse of movement. The struggle of the US, and I say US because the US is against Japan and US-UK against Germany. Don't underestimate the British contribution against Germany. To impose themselves on the phases before battle eventually leads to a military catastrophe. It's the British and the Americans winning the 3 stages before, pre-production, production, and deployment, by putting pressure on the German and Japanese system that leads to a collapse. From 1943 onwards, they lose a periodic ability to move their forces. They just often get stuck in place. And they can't get supplies in, they can't get supplies out. They can't make things because they can't move things around. And destruction of their forces happens from this. It could be anything from a Japanese-controlled island to which there is a very large force of very committed soldiers willing to fight and die, who then are simply cut off at sea, and the Americans bypass it and starve it. It has no military purpose. To German land forces and air forces that couldn't move, the most interesting example of that might be Bagration on the Central Front in 1944, when the German Army Group Center is attacked by the Red Army and runs out of equipment. Now, overall, I will admit that this is a somewhat controversial view of the war. I didn't actually set out to write it in that way. That wasn't what I was expecting to find, but it's what I found, so I wrote the darn book. And it does mean that the Eastern Front is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but it is not, from this point of analysis, at all the primary front. It is really a secondary front when it comes to the use of equipment. It is a primary front for infantry. It is a secondary front for everything else. So that is, in a nutshell, the view. Now I'm going to start putting this and moving to the Russo-Ukrainian war. But that, and by the way, if there are any questions about that, I'm going to go into more specifics of it tomorrow, but I'm happy to do it in the question period. Now, turning to the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, 2022. On the one hand, of course, it shows how unimportant my history is. No one even knew the book outside of a few Second World historians at that point, and sort of no one was quoting it, and everyone was presenting what I would call is a battle-centric view of what was going to happen. So when we talked about the Russo-Ukrainian war, and there was a lot in the analytical community, think tanks, there's a lot in the intelligence communities, there was a lot in the media. The way the war was presented was, I would argue, almost entirely battle-centric. What would decide the war was what happened when the two armies met in the field. So war had once more been reduced down. We can talk about this. I think one of the problems with this is actually war games too. War games give a very weird view of war because they are about battles as much as anything else. And therefore you want the battle result to affect the war. And that led to, I think, an extreme overestimation of how quick and easy this war would be. The battle idea of war made this look like it was going to be a walkover for the Russians. And by the way, this view was one that was widely shared not just publicly by analysts and think tanks, but from what we can tell also in the intelligence community. One of the, I don't want to say rewarding because nothing is rewarding about this, but one of at least the important things that's come out of this is I've been able to work on a project about the pre-February 24th analysis. That a group of us from St. Andrews and Johns Hopkins University got together right away and we said, something doesn't smell right here. That if you're going to talk about a war being over so quickly and cleanly, that doesn't make any sense. So we started collecting all the pre-war analysis we could find. And we actually have quite a large database now. It's almost 200 items. And we started breaking it down to try and understand how the war was said to, or was assumed would develop. One, and these are two examples, it would be fast and overwhelming. The speed of it was extraordinary, what people were writing. I mean, it was lightning war on steroids that was going to happen when the Russians unleashed on the Ukrainians, and had extraordinary specificity of time. This quote above, by the way, one of the most well-known, I'm just Xing out the names because I'm not trying to show up anybody, was the kind of thing people were saying. If Russia really wants to unleash its conventional capabilities, they could inflict massive damage in a very short period of time. They can devastate the Ukrainian military in the east really quickly, within 30 to 40 minutes. Not even poor Ukraine, not even an hour would it be before it would be devastated in the east. I've never seen, the US military couldn't do that. And yet we got into this point where the Russian military could devastate the Ukrainians in 30, 40 minutes. And then the second one, so if it opens up devastatingly, it's over in weeks. You might say the general timeline is the Russian devastates the Ukrainian military overnight, the first night. Kyiv falls within a week, the capital, and the war itself is basically over in weeks. So a day to week, 2 weeks. No one I found used months. It really was weeks, was the phrase, how long it would last in the war. Russia's military superiority would enable it to overrun Ukraine's army in weeks by launching multiple attacks. This was quite common The war would be over in weeks, and the Russian and the Ukrainian military would not. And it would be decided by the meeting of those armies in the field. All right? So the kind of equipment you had to start the war, that would decide how it ended. Yeah? Which again, if you look at it from the point of view of military history, is really weird. Because everyone, if you would say, we all teach in our class, everyone says the war will be over by Christmas. This was actually saying the war would be over tomorrow, not Christmas. But the war over Christmas never happens. So yet we had boiled the war down to something very, very quick, very clinical, and over very, very soon. And that has been something that has been, at least I think, worth doing, is to try and understand through this research project how this war was viewed. Because I think we don't, and we can talk about this in the questions, the key thing is not to do this again. I would argue we made war sound far too easy. I mean, if I was Putin and I thought I could devastate the Ukrainian military in 30, 40 minutes, I might go to war, right? I mean, what's to lose? It's going to be over soon, Ukraine's doomed, Kyiv in a few days, and the whole war over in weeks. But if instead you said this is going to be 2 years of blood and horror, it would have perhaps a different impact on psychological thinking. And I think we have to move away from that understanding of the quick clinical war, which, as far as I know, never happens even with the U.S. at the height of its power, after having the U.S. seen 20 years in Afghanistan and accomplished almost nothing. Well, what was Russia, and then to be more specific, how would Russia's battle victory occur? So we have this extraordinarily short timeline. What would happen within this extraordinarily short timeline? Well, the quote on the right, and I won't read the whole thing out, was actually from one of the most famous articles released just before the invasion, which argued, by the way, that Ukraine should not be armed. A lot of this argument was said, don't arm Ukraine, they don't have a chance, because I'm a genius analyst and the war is going to be over in a few days. So this is the way that article was, not just to describe that battle, and that is the description of a battle. It's entirely a battle description. It's to basically say, don't arm Ukraine. It's not worth it. So you would start off with Russian precision airstrikes, which would paralyze Ukrainian forces. Basically, the Ukrainians would almost sit out in the open and offer themselves up for sacrifice. And the Russians would boom, 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 drop bombs on all the crucial things. And the Ukrainians would be paralyzed. It was very common to see, from that devastating air and missile strikes to attack headquarters, aircrafts, and logistics points. They didn't mention logistics, but in a negative, as if, aha, we will destroy Ukrainian logistics. But as if the Ukrainians would simply sit there and take it. That you could easily disassemble them militarily. Once you paralyze the Ukrainian army with these airstrikes, you would then have sort of fast-moving Russian ground forces, which would move very rapidly through at least eastern Ukraine. All right? That it would get through Kyiv. The question was, how far east would they get before they would stop? Ukraine would be paralyzed in hours, Kyiv taken in days, and the war over in weeks. In fact, if you wanted to see the real sort of strong nature of this view, one of the real debates going on was, would Ukraine even muster an insurgency? There's more discussion about that than Ukraine's ability to fight Russia off. So the argument is the Russians will overwhelm them in the field. The Ukrainians will either have to retreat into the cities or indeed into far western Ukraine, maybe in the Carpathians, set up a guerrilla movement. That becomes the debate. And so there's a quite intense analytical debate about that. You can go back and find it all, whether it's worth it. Some people said, yes, and we should start arming Ukraine for an insurgency. But other people, including that article there, said, no, no, we shouldn't arm them even for an insurgency because they can't win that either. That the Russians will simply crush them, and you don't want to give them hope. That was a very interesting. You don't want to give the Ukrainians any hope they could win. So better to let them lose quickly and sacrifice them up, was the analysis that was made. And so that is, in a sense, the battle view of war. was the one I would argue was widely shared and widely sort of passed around within the analytical and intelligence communities. Within that, what was assumed and what was not. This also brings some interesting questions. One thing that this research project on the Russia-Ukraine war has brought out is that language that is used about power and war does a lot to create what I'll call sort of inevitable conclusions. You can use the language you use will almost draw you to make a conclusion, i.e. if you conclude the Russians are going to be precise and accurate and devastating, they are going to win the war quickly. One of the most interesting is that Russia was a great power. This was used constantly. Ukraine's not a great power, Russia is a great power. But no one defined what a great power was. It was just like a name. Russia is this, Ukraine is not this. All right? But really, why was Russia a great power? Well, it wasn't quite, they have nukes, okay? You know, they do have nuclear weapons, but is that the definition of a great power? They have an economy the size of Spain. If we gave Spain a lot of nuclear weapons, would we call Spain a great power? It's an arguable proposition, right? I mean, the Russian economy is much closer to Belgium's in size than to the United States. If you gave, 2 or 3 Belgiums nuclear weapons, would Belgium be a great power? You know? And I think, but what happened is the great power idea started to inform this battle-centric narrative. By the way, if you call something a great power, that, because you don't know and you don't have criteria, is a prophecy. It's not actually a qualitative judgment, because you don't have a qualitative judgment for what makes a great power. You are prophesizing that you think Russia is a great power. And we were told time and time again that Russia was a great power, Ukraine was not. And because if you're a realist, if you are labeled a great power, you sort of get to do what you want. All right? So the label gave the actual influence to the argument. Beyond that, what was fascinating also was the assumption that actually the Russian military would be able to do exactly what it wanted to do on maneuvers. The chance of screwing up was almost non-existent in this. Anyone who has studied war, it's chaos, it's madness, things go wrong, things break down. None of that seemed to be factored into the thinking. It was really that things were going to work. I go back, everything devastating against the Ukrainians. They would be surrounded from the start. They've repeatedly practiced this, which is a fact. They've practiced it, they must work. By the way, every military practices things, they don't always work. But having repeatedly practiced it, they therefore must be able to do it. And then I think, what was assumed, Ukraine would mount little resistance in the east. This was another interesting thing. There was some cultural discussion of the war, but it was almost entirely a cultural discussion of Ukrainian weakness and how that would impact battle. Which, by the way, continues to this day as Elon Musk is constantly pumping out the same stuff now. And that is that, those Ukrainians in the East, they really sort of are Russians. They speak Russian. I know for Belgians to think of, a country that has 2 languages might not actually be about to break apart, but that's the view that was given about Ukraine. That Ukrainians in the East weren't really Ukrainians. They sort of could be easily assumed into Russia. In fact, that they would go into Russia and they wouldn't offer much resistance. That was very commonly said, that basically there was an attack on Ukrainian culture and how it would undermine Ukraine in battle. And that, I'd even go even further. The other way it was interesting how it would undermine battle was culture and corruption. I didn't put it down there, but it's actually figured a lot more in the discussion. That we talk about Russia. As soon as the war came out, corruption became an issue. Before February 24th, corruption was a Ukrainian problem, not a Russian problem at all. In the discussion, it was widely said the Russians had corrected their corruption problem. Russian military no longer corrupt. Even though everyone at the top of it has the most luxurious super yacht you will ever see on a military salary, not corrupt. Corruption was a Ukrainian problem. Ukrainians, very, very corrupt. So it was interesting how the corruption label was put on Ukraine and not on Russia, I would argue, for many ways for cultural reasons. So we got that kind of, and I'm saying corruption is not a problem for Ukraine, but what's fascinating is the one-sided analysis of corruption that was brought out. So everything was to show why the war would be quick. Summing up these points, and I've probably gone on some tangents, everything was to show why the war would be quick and clinical. All of Russia's strengths were emphasized, all of Ukraine's weaknesses were emphasized. The result being a very quick and almost painless war, celebrated with a parade in Kyiv after a few days. Well, what was not discussed, you won't be surprised, almost nothing on sustainment or logistics. I found one article on logistics. That's all I've been able to find. The process of supplying, and that was sort of a highly speculative article without any evidence. It was very nice that someone wrote it. But if you look at these studies of what the war would be like, logistics don't figure. The assumption is the Russians will simply find a way to get things done. This is one of the great, you can't just simply get things done with logistics. You actually have to have the ability to move things. You know, UPS just doesn't make things up. Okay, they just don't find a way to get that package to you by thinking about it. They actually have all these, supply points around functioning. But there was no study of that going into the war, at least publicly released. The assumption was, I think maybe because the assumption was Ukrainian resistance would be so weak that the logistics problem would be surmounted. And of course, if you have that view, the last thing you're going to look at is production. There was no discussion of what happens if this war goes on for a year, because that seemed to be unimaginable. All right? But of course, now we are in the midst of a production war. We are in the war no one thought was going to be possible, because we are in a sustainment war. Almost everything, by the way, almost every soldier and almost every piece of equipment that crossed the border on February 24th or existed on both sides is now gone. The entire Russian army that crossed the border on February 24th is gone. I think about 95% of it's gone. So they've created an entirely new force, usually taking things out of storage. Same with Ukraine. Very few of the original Ukrainian soldiers are now on the battlefield. And very little of the Ukrainian equipment that they went to war with on February 24th is on the battlefield. So we have two entirely new armies that have been out there in force generation. Finally, there was very little on unpredictability. This, I think, was in many ways more surprising. No one actually talks about logistics. It's the great lie, Experts discuss logistics, amateurs discuss tactics, but then nobody actually looks into logistics. So it's not surprising that people didn't talk about logistics, because most people think it's sort of boring. However, what was more surprising is no one talked about unpredictability in war. Friction, Clausewitzian friction. What happens when armies meet, which is usually unpredictable. The assumption was unpredictability could be kept within reasonable bounds. So we don't have to assume that unpredictability is going to be that big of an issue. And because of all of these, basically the war we are in now was not considered possible. You add it all together, the emphasis was on the short war, not on the long war. So the situation we are in now is not one that anyone thought was possible. Now, all I'll say is, I didn't know the war was going to work out like this, but I was getting progressively more and more irate in December and January when I was reading these analyses that talked about the short war, because they made no sense to me as a military historian. So how the war was, and from how the war was won, I tried to make public cases saying, is Russia a great power? Can they actually make things? Is this war going to be as quick and clean? And this was the kind of thing I was trying to write, informed by how the war was won. So this was an article that came out in the British journal The Critic in January 14th, 2022, so a month and 10 days before. And it was more a really confused article. And I threw it out there and I go, none of this makes sense to me by how you are discussing war. Because Russia's not a great power. Yes, it has some pieces of equipment. And by the way, tanks don't make a power. I'll talk about that. Just counting up military weapons almost always does not make a power, i.e., let's look at Mussolini's military. Power is much more than the stock of equipment you have going into a war. And if you're going to base power on the number of equipment you have, war is ultimately about sustained military operations. I got that sentence in there. I was pleased about that because it just seemed to me that no one was talking about what actually wins wars. I can say hardly anyone read that article. This article was not, it didn't have any impact. It died like more than any other article I've ever written. And the analytical community said, this is nonsense, don't listen to O'Brien. And indeed, I tried to publish a follow-up piece in foreign policy. They turned it down in one day. I still have the rejection letter. I showed it to them. And they said, oh, that was just an intern. But it was just interesting to see, that at least from the point of view from how the war was won, what people were talking about didn't make a lot of sense, at least to me, in January 2022. So the war did not work out the way it expected, and what am I going to talk about in the next few lectures? Is that timing about right on this? Okay, cool. I'm going to try to go into case studies to talk about comparisons between the Second World War, these production phases, and then what we might be seeing in the Russo-Ukraine war. So tomorrow, and albeit within this overarching idea of what's a great power and sustainment, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about air power. That basically air power is far more complex than people thought before February 24th, 2022, and becoming even more complex. This is one of the reasons why long wars have to be expected. No one would have thought the most produced element of war fighting next year beyond ammunition in numbers will be drones. Take away bullets. I understand bullets and shells, there will be more. But if you take away bullets and shells, the most built piece of war equipment on both sides will be UAVs. Ukrainians are going to try and build 1 million of them in 2024. We don't know the Russian figures, but they're going to be pretty high. And no one was talking about mass UAV war 2 years ago. So the air war is becoming very complex and worked very differently. So that'll be tomorrow. The lecture on Wednesday, so I get the days right, will go into sustainment and logistics. So these ideas of what you're making, how you're deploying it, and where is it going. So I'll be breaking down that into parts, looking at the Second World War and now. And then the last lecture will be also what I think I got a lot of things wrong, and what we're learning about where things might be going. What are the questions to ask about where war is going and where this war is going. And I'll be talking about certain things that actually how the war was won failed on. How the war was won is brutally materialist. I never expected the power of information war that we have seen in the last 2 years. Arguably, Russia's millions spent on information warfare have been far more powerful than the billions spent on the military. The millions it has spent to co-opt parts of the Republican Party in the United States are keeping $60 billion in aid from reaching Ukraine now. So these kinds of elements of war lead, in many ways, me to say, yes, I agree with a lot of what I said and how the war was won, but there's a lot more going on as well. And these are things that hopefully we'll address in the next few days. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much for a very provocative and inspiring talk. We can now take a few questions from the public. Let's see here. Our colleague economist. Pierre-Guillaume.
Thank you, Thierry. Thank you for the presentation. So, as Peter pointed out, I'm a professor in economics, and I'm going to make a remark that is typical of an economist. So, as an economist, I'm very easily inclined to buy the idea that logistics matter. Now, as an economist, I must also make two comments. In the line of reasoning, in the argumentation, you do not take into account substitution and innovation. And what made me think about it is what you said about aluminum. You can also buy planes with wood. And during World War II, the Havilland Mosquito was built out of wood. There was a lot of wood in Messerschmitt 109. But anyway, you know that better than I do, I'm sure. But still, there is innovation. And that's also part of the reason why it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen, because people will be creative and they will find ways to go around sanctions, bombings, and so forth, and so on. And if I may make a second remark, again, I buy most of what you said, but isn't there some form of interaction between logistics and battles? What made me think of it is what happened in Kiev at the beginning of the war. The Russians wanted to seize the airport and they couldn't. Had they seized the airport, the logistics would have been quite different. Or maybe not, maybe I'm wrong, but it's a question. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Huh?
Those are brilliant. I mean, the second one is a real bugbear of mine, and I'll start with that first. This is the analytical community trying, it's been, you know Philip Tetlock's work about how one rationalizes failure? First it was, I was right. Oh, shoot. Well, I was wrong, but for the right reasons. Or, I was almost right. And people go through these stages, it's like grief, the stages of grief, but they never actually get to acceptance. It's always some way to explain. The Hostomel one, which is, by the way, being pushed by the analytical community, is basically to say, we were almost right. I can make a situation where the Russians take Hostomel brilliantly, get all their trucks up, stream into Kyiv, take Zelensky. Well, sure, I can make up a situation where it goes even worse for the Russians, but it didn't happen. So I don't buy the counterfactuals, because basically a counterfactual is the butterfly effect. You're going to change one thing, well, I can change one thing and then go down an entirely different road. So I don't find what I call the Hostomel counterfactuals at all convincing. They seem to me done by a group trying to justify its failure to say they were almost right. How else would they, even if they get Hostomel airfield, we don't know if they can get the trucks from Russia to Hostomel. We don't know if they can, Kyiv's a city of 6 million people. How are they going to get into the city of 6 million people from Hostomel? They didn't have enough force. So that one. Now, there's a lot going on in the first point, and I want to play that proper respect, because there is a lot. There is one great aircraft made out of wood. All right? That is the one that wasn't built out of aluminum. That is the British Mosquito, which is an incredibly useful secondary aircraft. It can't engage other aircraft. It can do one thing, it can fly faster than anything else because it's made out of wood. So until the jet fighter appears, the fastest aircraft is the Mosquito. And it's really annoying for the Germans. They really have a hard time dealing with it because it's so fast. But in and of itself, it can't fly over the battlefield because it can't last. So it has a very specific kinds of fast rating roles that you can do with the Mosquito. You still ultimately have to build these things out of aluminum if they're going to have survivability. And the more you replace with wood, the less robust they become, and the more they break when they land on deployment. By 1943-44, the Germans are trying to economize on bauxite in the way that you say, and actually in many ways you could argue that they have more losses because the aircraft are flimsier. On the other hand, there's so much that goes on about that. If I wanted to write the book that I would love, and probably, maybe you'd love it, but not many other people, would be about construction failures in the Second World War. The amount of, if I was going to say to you, what is by far the most expensive German weapon system? What would you say? What's that? The Heinkel 177 bomber. It was in a German attempt to build a 4-engine bomber. They tried for 7 years to build a 4-engine bomber. By the way, the 4-engine bombers are the most expensive weapons of the war. The United States spends twice as much building B-29 as it spends on the atom bomb. All right? The 4-engine bomber exists in a category of cost all above itself. The Germans spend years trying to build a 4-engine bomber, the Heinkel 177. It's a brilliant airframe. You've seen pictures. It's actually, it looks like an early B-29. It's sort of very advanced on the airframe, hugely sort of well thought out. The problem is they put the engines not 2 and 2, they link them front to back on the wing and they explode. So they do have 4 engines, but they link them front to back on the wing, not side by side. And they can't make that work, even after massive, massive investment. And that, they spend more on that aircraft than they spend on any other aircraft in the Second World War. The V-2 they spend a lot on, but it's still a relatively short time period, 43, 44, when they do the investments. But so the amount, and also the successor of the double-engined fighter, the Messerschmitt, what is it, the 222, the successor to the 122, if I'm getting that right, was hugely expensive and never worked. So you could do a huge story on construction failures. And you do it also for the United States. I mean, there is a B-17 that you've heard about, a B-24, maybe a B-25 and a B-29, but you haven't heard about the B-18, B-19, B-20, B-21, B-22, B-23, B-28, B-30, B-31. All of these were designed, and a huge amount of effort went into them, but in the end, they're put aside because they don't work properly. So you could do a really interesting study on, different kind of, those kinds of construction choices.
We have another question on the left, this time from a colleague in international relations.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your very interesting presentation. My question, the short version of my question would be something like, if battles are predictable, why do they occur? Because you've talked about the predictability of the battles during the Second World War, saying that, the results were predictable. At the same time, you highlight that there are many non-predictable, the element of non-predictability and friction, you highlight also plays an important role. So what do you mean by predictability? Is it some kind of after-the-fact predictability from the point of view of the historian in the retrospective? Or do you think that actually the actors themselves could have been able to predict the results of these battles?
I think, actually, it was interesting. Churchill says on the day after Pearl Harbor, I had a good night's sleep because I knew we were going to win the war. You could say, I'm not saying what happens on each day in each place is going to be exactly scripted. But the trends of the war are heading in a certain direction from 41, 42 onwards. And the battles simply reflect that trend. As another way, the British don't win a battle before El Alamein, they don't lose a battle after El Alamein. Now they do when they try one thing rash and stupid, Market Garden. So basically, you can do stupid things and lose a battle, but even losing that battle didn't actually change the course of the war. The Germans were losing the war. And that's why battles don't cause, they sort of reveal the forces that go on at the time. And I would say this is, and I'll talk about that probably on Wednesday's lecture, and this is where, I was waiting to see this summer. I think we've just seen that. No one can go forward in this war right now with the technology balance the way it is. It wasn't that Ukraine could have come up with a brilliant counteroffensive strategy, or indeed that Russia could come up with one. Going forward in this war, if the other side has defensive firepower and defensive lines, is almost impossible. It's just, the Ukrainians tried, the Russians have tried. We are now revealing the present state of play with defensive technology in this war. Now, I think there are ways to change that balance, but they're not going to be through doing what we're doing now.
But how come the historian knows this, but not the strategist?
I don't know. Strategists like to feel they're important. There's more things about the cult of generals. The cult, we write these cults of military commanders, and then maybe it sells books, or, we like to think there are brilliant generals doing things. But actually, probably most generals just plan, throw mass at a question and see what happens.
And here we have another economist.
Yes, thank you. Well, fascinating, thank you. Now you said indeed it's very materialistic way of presenting things and very convincing. This being said, indeed, as an economist, I'm thinking about individual human incentives. Yeah. And the human side was a bit absent. You know, the fact that, for example, the US indeed, they thought Ukraine was very, very weak, so they suggested that they would evacuate Zelensky, and he said famously, I don't need a taxi, I need weapons. But more importantly, you know, how do you explain with your analysis, you know, Vietnam or Afghanistan or things like that? So it seems that the way in which people decide to fight or not, more or less seriously. Now, of course, if they have no weapons, and again they are armed very, very well, that's a problem. But there are also at times what we would call as economists multiple equilibria. You know, it seems that in Mosul, a city of 1 million people, the Islamic State went with a couple hundreds soldiers and militants, and the Iraqi army just retreated. So how does that fit in your analysis?
I think it's a great question. I would say, how does this apply to counterinsurgency, or insurgency, counterinsurgency war? You know, which is the question. Well, on the one hand, the war is based on the fact that you have to damage a side before the battlefield, the production side. The problem with the counterinsurgency is they need very little to fight. So the real question is, are they willing to fight? And if they are willing to fight, my view is never get into counterinsurgency, you can't win. Because if you can't shut down a pre-production, production, and deployment phase of a war and continually shut it down, and in a counterinsurgency that is almost impossible to do because you don't have expensive aircraft, you have AK-47s and grenades, then really it becomes a political war. And if you are the United States, you're never going to win that. And by the way, why did the United States always gets war wrong? It's hard to think of a hegemon in human history that has been more stupid in its strategic choices than the United States. And you could argue on both sides of the aisle, for the past 25 years, it has made bad choice after bad choice at the period of its greatest power. Power does not mean intelligence. We sometimes think that. We sometimes confuse having power with being smart. But in the case of using military force, having power is not. In many ways, having power makes it too easy. The great comment, if you have a big hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you're the US, every issue looks like a nail. But that's just because they have this enormous hammer. And it's often not the right way to do things.
We have two more questions. Two questions from students. One from a Ukrainian student, Mikhail Chesko, and knowing Mikhail, a short question, please.
Of course. Yeah. Good evening. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very passionate. It was magnificent, very interesting. You described, like it seems to me, that you describe the World War II like Jean Fauvier describes the 100 Years' War. It's amazing. And my question is how Ukraine need to act to do what Ukraine need to do more to act asymmetrically in the war.
We'll take the second question and then you can answer both at the same time.
Hi, yes, my question is less about supply chains and logistics, unfortunately, but it is a little bit in relation. It's we talked a lot about Kyiv and how Kyiv should have fallen in days. How important is the capital / largest city falling in a conflict?
Yeah. Two great questions. By the way, come to the next 3 lectures because I can't answer that. I'm going to talk about that for all of the next 3 lectures in part. It's sort of what does Ukraine do now? Well, there's a lot of things it has to do. There's a number of layers that it has to do to fight the kind of asymmetric war we're talking about. So, I think there is a lot Ukraine can do, and actually I've been talking with a lot of Ukrainians about that. But they have to put it into place. It's a question of money and resources and everything. But so in a sense, I'll come back to that. That's sort of pathetic, I know, but it would take me an hour to answer that now. So I won't. Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I never thought this was a terribly convincing argument about Kyiv falling anyway, that it's based on a battle-centric view. Take the capital, run up the flag, woohoo, we've won. It seemed to be this idea that Ukrainian identity was so weak and Zelensky would somehow be sitting out in Maidan Square, the Russians would walk in, arrest him, shoot him, there'd be no political, ability to fight, and the war would be over. It never made any sense. I mean, that you can lose capitals and keep fighting. Look at Afghanistan. Kabul falls in the first few days of that war, and that doesn't end the war. So the whole paradigm by which the war was judged seems to me fatally flawed.
Thank you very much. It has been a great privilege and a source of pride for this university to have been able to organize for 11 years in a row controversial and counter-current lectures by brilliant historians, and you have absolutely confirmed this role. This chair is a series of 4 lectures, but it also comes with a prize, and I now leave the pleasure to Baudouin Velge to hand you the Baron Velge Prize.
Yes, well, first, of course, a word of thank you, I think, for the whole audience. This was absolutely fascinating. I liked very much the text nobody read, and you had difficulty in finding someone wanting to publish it, and was spot on in January 2 years ago, and it was really fascinating to listen to everything you said, because it's so well underbuilt. It looks evident, but then you give very concrete examples of things that we knew without knowing them, except for one. The very first slide, where 50% of what the Germans were spending was on aircraft, I have to say that I had no clue whatsoever, and it would have certainly have been completely wrong, and I think most people in the room would have been. So thank you very much. Now, the Baron Velge Prize, which carries the name of my father, which we call also the Jean van Welkenhuizen Prize, because he would have given that name. But we are very happy to be able to give it to you. You are number 11, but certainly not the last in the quality of who we got. Thank you very much indeed.
So we have a chair, we have 4 lectures, we have 1 prize, but last but not least, we also get a drink. So you're all very much invited. The drink will take place in the refectory, which is on the 1st floor. So just follow the crowd, and you're all very welcome to continue our discussions with a glass of wine. Thank you.